talked to Kevin about this.
Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was talking to Kevin today, and we talked about potential subjects, and I thought that maybe what I would do is just go through sacred geometry and the Temple of Luxor in a little bit more detail to give you an idea of some of the rationale behind the things that I'm doing. So what I would say is, generally speaking, as humanity has evolved, they have discovered things that work extremely well for producing higher states, but they have never been able to really reach super higher states. And to give you an idea of the kinds of power, kinds of ways, and the kind of effort that they've produced to make these higher states occur.
Come on, Joshua, don't talk to me this way.
Everybody there and cool?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So these things have occurred throughout history. Many of the types of things that they've done in the past is they've worked out various ratios between the sun, the stars, the moon, various parts of the earth. Actually, it's fairly well established, I think, that Egypt knew the circumference of the earth based upon using shadows and things like that thousands and thousands of years BC. So these ratios, these Fibonacci ratios, which are certain ratios and proportions, tend to recur in nature on a very, very regular basis. The proportions in the heavens, they tend to recur. And the reason for that is the world is what's called, it's based a lot upon fractals. And fractals are things that have a recurrence, but they don't necessarily have the same exact recurrence every time, but they work upon a certain set of ratios that occur all the time. But they most of the time will recur in a sort of a random way. So even though they're recurring in a very methodical, intelligent way, or let's not say intelligent, let's just say a very methodical, observable and definable way, they very seldom recur on a regular way to where they can be predictable. So what you find is that nature has this way of having predictability and unpredictability at the same time. The best illustration I know of is the stock market. The stock market has a great deal of reproducibility to it. Most moves in the stock market are based upon Fibonacci ratios. And a perfect example of that is the stock market tends to move up in 3 up waves, and it tends to correct in 3 down waves. And each one of these waves usually corrects within a 0.38 or 38 to 62% of the original move to the upside. And these are Fibonacci ratios. So these things have been observed throughout history. The stock market, because it's a living thing that recurs constantly 24 hours a day in some form, gives people a very, very observable, pictorial way of looking at the Fibonacci ratio of life on Earth recurring on a regular basis. It's almost like a person taking the blood pressure of somebody or whatever, various types of physical things that they're monitoring. The stock market is a sort of a sum total of all the effects of those things on the economy, and the economy is highly responsive because people respond to economic things very quickly. The economy is highly responsive to external stimuli. And what they found is, in history, is these external stimuli can be affected by certain things that occur, by certain things that you can do to make the affectation occur. In the case of what we do, we produce a signal that is extremely powerful and extremely positive and almost pervasive because it tends to cancel out negative counter frequencies, and so therefore has this smooth effect on your psyche, on your physiology, and the rest. And the reason we're able to accomplish that is because we have modeled the machines upon human physiology to a certain extent. this has recurred throughout history, where this attempt at affecting other human beings by emulating their physiological capabilities has occurred throughout history. The best example of it would probably be the Temple of Luxor in Egypt, which essentially was used as a healing temple and also an affecting temple in the following ways. Each little section of the Luxor temple, first of all, the overall temple is built in the form of a human being, a man that has his legs at a certain strange angle. I'm sure there's a reason for it. I'm sure I've read it, but I don't remember. But it's essentially a temple of a man. And it has a head, a torso, arms, legs. And, of course, each one of these parts of it, or the exoskeleton at least, are caused by, are produced by pillars. But inside of these pillars, at least in the original version, were these little conclaves, whatever you want to call them, where you would go in and pray for a certain part of the anatomy. For instance, if you had a problem with your stomach, there's a certain part of the temple that is a portion for the stomach area. So you would go in there and pray for your stomach, or for the stomach of the person you were praying for, and that would theoretically have an effect on that person. And because evidently it was extremely effective, this massive temple complex was produced in which the priest could go in there and operate on a regular basis, dealing not only, cutting something out or whatever they might do on an allopathic way, but also dealing with it on a spiritual way, in a spiritual way. Now, it's known now that there are many levels of modality where certain things can be worked on in a person's physiology to make them more optimal. The least optimal would be the physiological side, where you basically go in and cut it out. Then you go to the next level, which would be drugs, I would say. The next level might be something like acupuncture, where there's a certain amount of energy involved. The next level would be something like gem elixirs or flower essences, highly esoteric forms of physiological response based upon not just a biological entity such as a hormone or whatever, but also just on a water representation of it. That would be like homeopathy. And then you would get into the higher levels yet, which is bioresonance and distance energy, where you're building up the aura and whatever. This is the area that they worked in primarily, was the highest level one, where they were actually praying and producing incantations, which allowed, they believed, certain things to be affected. The problem with all these things is that they just didn't have a very large amount of power compared to which that power which is available to us now. Let me just give you an example of how this might work. As you may or may not know, the Pharaoh was essentially the spiritual leader of Egypt. He was the Pope. Before he was anything else, he was the spiritual leader. Egypt itself was extremely spiritually oriented. They did everything they possibly could to make these temple complexes produce the maximum amount of energy possible. They lined it up with stars a certain way. They lined it up with underground water systems in a certain way. Everything they could possibly do to reproduce the highest amount of power. They lined it up with ley lines, magnetic lines, fields of flux going through the earth. Anything they could do to enhance their prayers and incantations and whatever they came up with that they thought was usable at the time, they used. The problem with those things is, even though they did have power, they did not have extremely high power, but they had the highest power available at the time. So what you find is in the Temple of Luxor is you see that being reproduced throughout Western Europe at later times. Almost all the Gothic cathedrals in Europe are based on the Temple of Luxor in one form or another. Remember the two great big gates in the front of Luxor? You look at the old Gothic cathedrals, you have those two great big spires that are right in the center with a door in the center. So there's a lot of similarity between the way those things were put together and the way the Temple of Luxor was put together. They also had powerful underground water sources, which produce a certain amount